Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Sheikha Fatima Barkatulla. You're most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, Paul, and listeners and viewers.
Yes, listeners and viewers. Sheikha Fatima is an award-winning British Islamic scholar, alima, author, and broadcaster. She studied Arabic and Quran studies at Al-Azhar in Egypt and has 2 Alamiya degrees from Islamic seminaries in the UK. She holds an award-winning master's degree in Islamic law from SOAS, that's the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and also a postgraduate diploma in English law from one of the top law schools in the world, the Dixon Poon School of Law at King's College in London. And she's authored a groundbreaking book, Khadija, Islam's First Lady. And also there's a forthcoming book, both for children, by the way, provisionally titled Aisha in the Prophet's Heart. So both of these books are aimed at children's readership, but absolutely fascinating. Now, to business. Certain UK politicians and the right-wing press have been up in arms recently about the so-called burqa in Britain. The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, says bosses should have the right to ban staff from wearing burqas, and she says she wouldn't allow someone into her constituency's surgery if they were wearing a face covering. Other MPs say the time is now right to have a conversation about banning the burqa, asking if it has any place in Western societies where we believe, they say, in freedom for women and gender equality. So what is it with the West's obsession with the veil? What's your perspective?
Yes, Jazakallah khairan, Paul, for bringing this topic up, because it's reared its ugly head once again, right, in the news. Yeah. And for me, it's like Groundhog Day, really, because many years ago, before COVID, just sort of after 9/11, I would say, there was a flurry of, anti-Niqab, Islamic, news, and it was all related to the Niqab. It was all related to the so-called burka or burka, as people call it. And I think at that time, it was very much related to the war that was going on, against Afghanistan, So there was this narrative that these poor Muslim women, in Afghanistan, they need saving, and our boys, right, our army, our boys are going to go out there and going to liberate these Muslim women. They'll kill their men and bomb their country, but it's all for the sake of these poor Muslim women. And that narrative actually is not a new narrative. It's not a new narrative by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I was just reflecting on my own childhood, in the UK. 2 things came to mind. So I did English literature at college for A-level. And we studied Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I remember, I love the book, such an interesting story, and the message that she was trying to give is actually relevant for today as well, the wider message. However, within the book, she has this little vignette, so like a story within the story, and it's about this Arab woman, Safi, who escapes her father's control. She has a Christian mother and a Muslim father, a Turkish father. And she escapes her father's control to reunite with her Christian lover. And, she wants to embrace her mother's side, the Western ideals, right? And this is a story within the story of Frankenstein, and the monster, for anyone who knows the story, is listening in on this story and seeing these characters reunite and all of that. And I remember, so I was about 18, 19 at the time, 18. And I remember thinking, God, this is so typical, this is so anti-Islam, because there, and we're talking hundreds of years ago now, right? We're talking, in the time of Mary Shelley. Safi is portrayed as quite sympathetically. She's like a very free-spirited woman, but she's trapped because she has this father who, Mary Shelley describes as a treacherous Turk. Okay, so the whole trope of a brown man, the brown man or the non-Western man, the non-European man, as this savage, as this controller of women, and whereas the European man as the liberator, right? It goes back really far back, and the East as the other, as exotic but inferior. So her father, he's portrayed as like this dishonest, manipulative man who's, he's an authoritarian figure. He's trying to take her back to Turkey, away from the freedom of the West. Okay, these are really familiar tropes for us, right?
Orientalist tropes, isn't it? As you say,
absolutely. And I think Edward Said highlighted that, right? Exactly. Like in his book.
I just read that book, Orientalism. The classic is the Bible of neo-colonialist studies at universities. So Edward Said, who himself was a Palestinian in origin, Christian, I think, he was a professor in America. But his book on Orientalism is absolutely necessary reading to get a broad understanding of the West's Orientalist perspective and how biased and how unrepresentative and inaccurate it is when it comes to speaking of the Muslim world, of course. Yeah. And
of course, back in those days, it was literature, right? Literature was the media, right? Was the entertainment and the media. So as Edward Said highlights, Western literature casts Muslim men as oppressive. It casts Muslim women as passive, admirable, exotic, but only if they choose the West. They're like waiting to be liberated. And if they choose the West, then they're like these Safi type figures. Yeah. Right. So there was that. And then I reflected on, coming back to the modern day, Jasmine, Princess Jasmine in Aladdin, right? In Disney's Aladdin. Okay. And that was obviously, like, I was a child when that came out, and we were mesmerized by it. And I watched Disney's Aladdin. But, throughout it, there were like these little digs at Islam, kind of hidden digs. Okay. There's too many to mention right now, but I'll mention a couple. And so, for example, Jasmine, Princess Jasmine, the whole thing in the story is that her father is stopping her from marrying Aladdin, or allowing her to marry who she wants to marry, right? Not giving her freedom because of this law. There's a law, and I couldn't help but think, what does that law represent, in this story? Because the whole story is about her trying to escape that law. Mm-hmm. She wants to be free. She wants to, and to me, Aladdin represented the West. His song, for those of us who remember the songs from Aladdin, the main song that he sings is "I can show you the world," right? Like, basically, come with me and I'll open all the doors for you. I'll set you free, right? That's the whole premise of the whole story, right? And there was just so many little things throughout, So again, this free-spirited woman who wants to escape from her father and this law, this oppressive law. I wonder what that oppressive law could represent. Another trope, I would say, type of conditioning that the Western mind, including us, actually, growing up in the West, have been through. And I think it's worth just taking a moment to take stock of that, like that has happened, and that has been happening throughout our childhood, throughout our lives, and throughout the lives of people who are now, sometimes getting riled up, getting upset about things like the niqab. It's not just about the niqab. I think it's civilizational.
Yeah. Can I just clarify for everyone, because there's a lot of confusion here, I think, about exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the niqab and what we call in the West the burqa and the hijab and so on. So you are obviously wearing the niqab now as we speak, but you're not wearing the burqa, are you?
So yeah, if we want to be technical about it, burqa is like I think it's an Urdu or a more kind of Urdu, Afghani, Eastern type of word, right? It's not Arabic, from what I know.
Right.
As far as I know, or it's at least it's used more in, in places like India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. The word, but yeah, it's usually like it's like a garment that you wear outdoors, and it has like a big flap, and you can just open the flap, and your face will be visible, and you can close the flap, and sometimes the flap has like a net going across it, right?
Yeah.
And niqab is like more what I guess is more worn in the Arab world, in the Gulf countries especially. And I mean, hijab has evolved to mean just the general Muslim woman's dress or her headscarf and her modest clothing. Yeah. I think, to be honest, to me, that's not so important. Okay, and the reason why is it's really the whole concept of covering the face. I think that's being discussed, and that's being attacked. But also, it's just a wider attack on Islam. I don't think we should even see it as being about the veil or the face. I think it's like, do you really think that once the niqab is banned, that suddenly, Muslims are going to be accepted and the hijab will be accepted and, everything about us will be fine and dandy? No, I don't think so. Not at all. I think the niqab is like the first line, right? The first line that needs to be crossed in the eyes of certain people who see Islam and Muslims as a threat.
Well, can we just address this point about the niqab, because it is for many people. I know you did an interview on, I think it was LBC a while ago, which I heard, and the interviewer herself, obviously a woman, clearly was stating that the niqab in some way is a symbol of female subjugation, and she mentioned Afghanistan a great deal. But obviously we're not in Afghanistan, but could you just address this whole question of I want to look at some of the facts and the fiction about the niqab, and the first kind of question really is it a symbol of female subjugation, as is alleged?
So I think for Muslim women and for Muslim men, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our creator, has given us guidelines for dress. He's given us guidelines for, or commands for how we should dress in private and public, what the parameters are. There's a lot of freedom actually in that regard within that. However, in terms of like definitions and details, but there are some general rules and parameters. And so I think what a lot of non-Muslim people or people in, who are not familiar with Muslims sometimes misunderstand is that Islam is only talking to women, is only giving rules for women. There are actually quite a lot of rules for the men as well. Cool. So for example, I just mentioned some. So for example, for Muslim men, they must always cover in front of others. So of course, like when you're within your home, when you're with your spouse, for example, there are no rules, right? But when you're within your home, even in front of your relatives, there are certain rules. And then when you go out into the public, there are certain rules. So for Muslim men, for example, the area between the navel and the knee should always be covered, should be loose as well, loose clothing. So a Muslim man, a religious Muslim man, shouldn't wear, for example, Speedos, right, or anything like that in public, in front of others. So there is modesty for Muslim men. And actually, many scholars say also...
They're not Muslim men, shouldn't also be undressing in changing rooms, say at swimming pools or whatever.
Right. In front of other men, even in front of other men, yes. That's
also prohibited, again, on the grounds of modesty. And men shouldn't be shaking the hands of women who they are not directly married to, not non-marriageable people. They shouldn't be shaking their hands in any context. Is that right?
Well, the whole point is that touch, the physical touch between men and women is a sacred thing, right? And it requires God's permission for it to take place. So if of course, like as Muslim women, when we're with our husbands or when we're with our fathers, brothers, male relatives who we can't normally marry, okay, who wouldn't marry and we can't marry, then we are very free, right? So like the presenter on LBC, Sheila, she was under the impression that, and I think a lot of people are, that Muslim women have to dress like this all the time, right? Like they dress in their hijabs or niqabs or whatever their Islamic dress is all the time. I mean, I remember because my friends at school used to ask me, I wasn't wearing a face veil, but I was wearing, a scarf with my uniform. And they would always ask me, do you wear that in the shower? Do you wear that to bed? And it's funny to ask, but actually maybe some people genuinely don't know, right? And so I think part of it is educating people that actually, look, for the Muslim woman in her home, she was probably dressed just like you, right? Just like the average woman, right? She can wear whatever she wants. She's relaxed. She's in her home, or she's with male relatives or any women. She's very free to dress as she wishes. Even then, there is a level of modesty. Like you said, you wouldn't walk around even a women's only changing room undressed completely, right? But the rules would be a bit more relaxed. When it comes to going out in the public space in front of men who aren't closely related to you, then I would say there's a type of uniform, right? There's a type of uniform. There are certain parameters, there's certain parts of the body that the Quran commands Muslim women to cover. Okay, first of all, the Quran tells both men and women to lower their gazes, and to control their desires, of course. But then it also has guidelines for dress and tells Muslim women to wear outer garments, wear garments that cover what they would normally wear in the home when they go out, right? And of course, some scholars have interpreted that to include the face. Okay, so the I would say sometimes you hear Muslims saying, oh, the niqab or covering the face is cultural, it's not Islamic. Okay?
Yeah, because they say the niqab isn't in the Quran, and I'm sure in the comments below we're going to get this. There are going to be people telling me, oh, it's not in the Quran, don't pretend it is, and all this. But in fact, and Muslims there are different schools of thought on this. It's not like everyone Muslims agree. So some scholars, as you say,
but I don't think. Sorry, Paul. I was going to say, but I don't think anyone can say that it's not part of our religion. So I think that's a mistake that some Muslims make when they're trying to be overly defensive and like overly appeasing to Westerners, because the idea of covering the face as being part of the hijab and part of a Muslim woman's dress when she goes out is at the very least considered recommended, by the Islamic scholars, and at most obligatory. Okay, so it's seen as a good thing. It's a good practice at the very least, or it's, by some scholars, it's considered obligatory. So some women are wearing it, are going out, observing, covering their faces because they believe it's obligatory. Okay, and others do it. So I myself, I don't wear it all the time. Okay.
I've seen you wearing a hijab in public events, but mostly in the niqab, but sometimes not. Actually, this is true.
Yes, and for me personally, it's because I consider the niqab to be mustahab, meaning recommended. It's a good thing. Right. So if I'm, for example, wearing makeup, if I've done something that beautifies my face or draws attention to my face, I will wear the face veil. If I'm interacting on the camera and in public spaces, I prefer to wear the face veil for my own modesty and privacy reasons, and I think that as well is a little bit threatening in the West at the moment. The idea that a woman should have the agency to say, what, this is me, this is my body. I don't know what happened to my body, my choice.
Well, this is just pause on this point. I'm hearing constantly. I hear this in France. I hear this in the UK and everywhere. There's a woman's right to choose. A woman's body is a right to do with it what she wishes, and she can wear what she likes. You won't have men telling her what she can wear, or society dictating what she must wear. And yet, when it comes to Islam and Muslims, the whole thing is put on its head, and it's the reverse. that we will tell Muslim women what that they shouldn't wear this, and it's disliked that they should wear this, and it's very authoritarian. Everyone's telling women how they should behave, and it's a complete.
And I don't think we should ignore that this might have also something to do with the surveillance state, right? Like, because very soon, and actually it's already being rolled out, we've got face recognition going on, right? We've got all of that going on, and obviously people who cover their faces are not going to be able to be detected, right? So I do think there is something in that as well, the kind of the control of the state and the state being able to control people, I think has a part in that. I just want to kind of make sure that people understand this, though, because sometimes people, like you said, people say it's not in the Quran. And once I had a journalist say to me, a non-Muslim journalist say to me, could we interview you? You're an Islamic scholar. Is it true that I believe that the niqab is not in the Quran, right? And whatever I said, she would just insist, but it's not in the Quran. And I said, I thought you were interviewing me, like as as
not the way around.
So it's like she'd already made up her mind. She'd already made up her mind, that this was the narrative that she had to pursue, that this isn't a part of your religion. I'm like, let me tell you what's part of my religion, So I think it's important to note that in Surah Al-Ahzab, which is the 33rd surah of the Quran, ayah number 59, the translation is, O Prophet, tell your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers, which means the Muslim women, to draw their outer garments, and the word is jalabib, over their bodies.
Right.
That will be better so that they may be recognized as believing women and not be molested or annoyed. And God is ever forgiving, most merciful. Now, this verse was revealed for all Muslim women, telling them that when they go outside. So by the way, in early Islam, there was no hijab, right? So the women would dress the way Arab women dressed.
Right.
But this is in the Medinan period. So in Medina, which is after the Hijrah, after the Prophet ﷺ had moved to Medina, and he was establishing the Muslim state. Yeah. And many of the laws came down during that time, right? Yeah. And one of them was this, that when Muslim women go out, they should be recognized as believing women, differentiated from the Christians, Jews, and polytheists, right? And even from slaves, actually.
Yeah.
So some scholars interpret this word jalabib, okay, which means outer garments. A jilbab is like a bit like what Iranian women wear, like a chadar, right? Right. Something that covers you from head to toe.
Yeah.
But loosely, it means, an outer garment, something you wear outdoors that covers everything. Some scholars interpreted that to include the face, okay, and hands, and others interpreted it to mean except the face and hands, okay? Right. And again, in Surah Nur, there are two verses. One is, actually, there's a verse, verse 31, Surah Nur, which is chapter 24, verse 31. Allah says, and tell the believing women to lower their gazes and guard their private parts. Before this, of course, Allah tells the believing men to lower their gazes. And then it goes on, and not to show their adornments except what normally appears thereof. Right. And let them draw their head coverings, khumurihinna. Khumur means something that khimar is something you wear on your head, over their chests, okay, over the front of their bodies. So in this verse, again, the interpretation was that adornment, meaning do not show their adornments, means the parts of their body, including their faces, okay, according to some scholars. And then according to others, it didn't include the face and hands, okay? Right. And Arab women, they used to have their necks and their chests sometimes exposed. They would wear some sort of head covering, but they had the front of their bodies exposed and maybe their ears as well. So this verse was saying actually cover even the front part of your body, and draw whatever you're wearing on your head over your chest. So the conditions of hijab in general are obviously should be something loose, cover everything but the face and hands, according to some scholars, and including the face and hands, according to others, should be opaque, not see-through, right? It should be not showing a woman's shape and her body. And I think I've covered everything. And that it should not be like a dazzling display in and of itself. So it shouldn't be like something that's like, I don't know, like full of sparkly things and things
what
like
about
that,
colours though? Because it's always associated with black, and you're not wearing black. You're wearing, I don't know, turquoise or purple or something. I mean, okay, it can't be ostentatious, full of, you know, sparkly things, but can it be any? In principle, it could be any color. It could be white, or yellow, or red.
I mean, maybe not shocking pink or something like that. You know, like maybe not something that. And this is the thing, Paul, that there is a lot of leeway, because Islam has always recognized that there's different cultures and different peoples, right? So when you travel across the world, you see that different societies and different cultures have developed different dress that fulfills the, I would say, the kind of the conditions, but is quite different, right? So women in Malaysia have a different way of dressing. Women in, India, Pakistan, have developed clothing that could be practical. For example, shalwar kameez, it's quite practical, but it's very loose and very comfortable. So a woman who's working in the field, for example, she could continue doing that. And again, across the world, so there is leeway for color, there's leeway for material and things like that,
Okay.
But there are conditions.
Indeed. Now, another objection that's sometimes made by certain people is that women who wear the niqab can't possibly contribute to society. Basically, they're somehow constrained by what they wear. They can't fully participate. And this is another reason, perhaps, to consider banning the burqa, as they will put it. How would you respond to that?
I think the whole COVID period has proven to everyone. I mean, it made quite a lot of people shut up for a long time, I think, about the niqab, because everyone was wearing
niqab. Men and women were wearing niqab at one point, it seems.
Right. Yeah. And guess what? Life went on, right? Like literally, people were having meetings over Zoom. And I remember before that, everyone was like, "How can you live? How can we have a society that doesn't meet face to face and doesn't, see people's faces?" And so, look, I think there are. I think it's important to mention this, actually, that there are actually situations where even within Islam, the scholars say that a woman should uncover her face, even those who say that it's obligatory. And I want to mention that because I think sometimes, this is going to be controversial, but sometimes women in the West, Muslim women in the West, who have maybe come to Islam, or even those of us born into Muslim families and discovered Islamic rulings, and who want to be very devout and who want to, follow these laws. I think sometimes we don't realize that actually the Sharia tells us to be very practical, right? So I'm going to give you some examples. For example, the scholars say that when it comes to a marriage proposal, right, when you're seeing somebody for marriage, obviously you should uncover your face, right? It's fine to do that. Or even some scholars say even more than that, that you can actually not wear hijab, in certain circumstances in order to be seen for marriage and for somebody to be able to make, a decision about that. Also in business dealings, okay? So, for example, if you went into a bank, if you went into, actually the scholars say they're talking about the marketplace, right? Because when you're doing a business dealing, the idea is that the person should be able to see who they sold and bought from, right? So would you believe even scholars, conservative scholars who consider the niqab to be, or covering the face to be, obligatory, even they give certain situations. So it's not like the way sometimes some of us in the West practice it, which is, like I'll wear it no matter what. Like, it's actually not like that. I'll give another example. Even in court cases under Islamic law, the scholars of fiqh, when you read how they describe it, when a woman's giving testimony she should uncover her face. Obviously, like that kind of makes sense, right?
Otherwise, you could be anyone who's just standing there. The judge is not sure you really are Mrs. X who claimed to be whatever.
Right. So it's not like Islam is unreasonable, also, like for a judge to be able to see her, or whether if she's a witness, if she's giving testimony for medical treatment, obviously, right? So those are just some of the examples that.
Can I ask you about one to ask you about? Okay, so when you travel abroad, when you go through foreign immigration, passport control, presumably your passport doesn't have you wearing a niqab.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the ruling on that? Can you discreetly show your face to a female employee, say at passport control or immigration, to verify who you are? Is that presumably you wouldn't just? What are the rules about that?
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't wear a niqab when I'm traveling, because I like I said, if you read what the scholars say, when it comes to those type of settings where security is a situation, right? There's a security situation or identification is necessary. There's no requirement, So, but just practically speaking, yes, of course, thousands of Muslim women who wear the niqab, and especially people in the Gulf, in those cultures where it's the norm. How do you think they function? How do you think they have a lot more security than Western countries, actually, right? And that's exactly what they do, as you said. They have either female members of staff who can check the person's identity. So at the airport, I've seen. You like go through this in Saudi Arabia and places like that. You'll go through this. So when you're coming out of or going into the airport or coming out, whatever, you're separated. So the women will go through a particular room, and then there's like these two women, and they're checking the identity, and then or as far as I'm concerned, even if it's a man, you can uncover your face. If there's no women there, you're allowed to uncover your face in order to be identified. So this is what I mean about like us not going to extremes as well. Sometimes we don't know that.
Is there not about necessity dictating exceptions? I mean, not just in this, but even eating pork in certain situations for Muslims, right. Necessity dictates that's the only thing that they can do. So my reason I'm mentioning that is that there is a flexibility and pragmatism, as you say, in the Sharia, just using common sense, not going to extremes, not making life really difficult for people, not causing issues, security, passport, banks, and just using common sense. So not being absolutist and extreme. And that flexibility and pragmatism and wisdom, arguably, is part of the Sharia. This is not kind of a liberal, modernist take, is it, on the Sharia? You're saying right. Even conservative scholars.
No. In fact, it might not even need to be to the level of necessity. It could even just be for a need. That there's a need for this. Yeah. So I think we also, as Muslims, need to realize, which fights to fight. Do you know what I mean? Like not every situation is a situation where you need to make a fuss about things. The Sharia doesn't require you to do that, right? And I'm talking about, like I said, scholars, classical scholars. You can read from a number of books of classical Islamic law where they give scenarios. They say, if she's doing any kind of transaction, even right, where she needs to be identified, that she should uncover her face. Is considered normal, even like when she's renting a property, right? Like literally, and that makes sense, right? So I think the thing is, Islam is very practical, and a woman has, and this is what the West is kind of missing as well, is that the woman has a right, if she chooses to follow Islam, right? If she chooses to follow Islam, then you're oppressing her by telling her you can't follow these laws. You can't hold an opinion, right, that you want to adopt. We will tell you what you must adopt and what you mustn't, right? But there's something I want to highlight, and that's in this book, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's called The Political Psychology of the Veil by Sahar Gomkhor.
Who's it published by?
It's published by Palgrave
Oh, yeah.
Palgrave Macmillan, I think that's how you pronounce it. And she highlights, and this is why, like, Paul, I'm sort of done with going onto the media and talking about the niqab, because I really think it's like a bit of a trap, you know. It's a bit like the whole, you know, do you condemn condemn question, right? It's a bit like that. Like, let's get you to talk about this piece of cloth, when actually the malady, the problem is a way bigger problem that the West has. And so she really brilliantly highlights in this book, you know, what's the psychology behind this obsession with the veil, right? It's actually nothing to do with the veil. And she talks about how unveiling is actually about the West's anxieties about itself. Okay, the West uses the image of the veiled woman to deal with its own fears and to remind itself that we're the good guys, right? Like just remember, everyone, we're the good guys, we're the liberated, we represent freedom, right? And so when they see this woman and this idea that this woman has chosen to do this of her own accord, it's a threat. It's a threat to that narrative, right? The second thing she highlights is, so just a quote to mention from the book, she says, the impulse to unveil is more than a desire to free the Muslim woman. What lies at the heart of the fantasy of saving the Muslim woman is the West's desire to save itself, which I thought was quite interesting. And then she says, you know, so saving this Muslim woman is tantamount to saving the liberal narrative.
Yeah.
You know, we are the champions of freedom, human rights, and gender equality. But because everyone can see now, you know, that actually internally these values are often being contradicted. You know, we've seen there's racism rampant in Western society, sexism. You know, women are exploited in ways that they aren't in other countries, right? In the East, surveillance, all of these kind of oppressive things, and also like what we've seen, you know. The champions of human rights completely ignore human rights when it comes to our brothers and sisters in Gaza, for example, right? When they're confronted with that reality of like actually we're not what we say we are, it causes them a huge discomfort. And rather than confronting those contradictions, the West externalizes the problem, right? Those people, they oppress women. Those people are, you know, against the oppressive, savage brown man, and we are the protectors of women, right? So they're deflecting, you know, that kind of inconsistency onto others. She also talks about how this is interesting. She says the veiled body is like a knowledge boundary. So what she says is the veil demarcates invisible boundaries in Western knowledge making. It signals a hidden other which the Western gaze wants to reveal and control. Okay, and you know, Frantz Fanon, who was a psychologist.
Oh yeah.
And he, you know, wrote a lot about in the post-colonial and colonial context.
Yeah.
He has this famous essay, right, called Algeria Unveiled.
Mm-hmm.
And he highlighted this as well. So this is like a continuation of the whole colonial mindset, right? Yeah. Where in his essay about Algeria, he says, you know, that the colonial strategy was, if we want to destroy the structure of Algerian society, and by the way, at that time, if you look at any pictures of Algerian women, they used to wear white, like jilbabs, which are like basically like burkas, right? White garments that covered their faces as well, right? That was the norm in Algerian society. And when the French turned up there, they made it their policy to try to get Muslim women to stop veiling. They had advertising campaigns, right? There's a famous one where it says, you know, aren't you beautiful?
Yes.
Then unveil, right?
Yeah.
So he says if their strategy was, if we want to destroy the structure of Algerian society and its capacity for resistance, we must first of all conquer the women. We must go and find them behind the veil. And then he goes on to say, you know, every veil that fell, and basically women started unveiling. You know, there were women who started unveiling because they couldn't progress in society, or their husbands were pressured and were told, you know, you won't be given any kind of position or any kind of job if your wife is veiling, right? So he says every veil that fell was a negative expression of the fact that Algeria was beginning to deny herself and was accepting the rape of the colonizer. So a few months back, I tweeted about this and I said, look, the hijab and the niqab, in other words, the Muslim woman's dress, it's not really just about a religious, following a religious law. At the moment, in our times, it's an act of resistance. Mm-hmm. I really believe that. It's one of the fronts of resistance, because this colonial narrative of the West is best, and modernity and the Western system has to be spread throughout the world, liberalism, etc. You can see that even the enemies of Islam, you could call them, see the Muslim woman as essential to penetrating, if you want to call it that, in order to win that battle, the battle that's in their mind.
Mm-hmm. I think that is much more ideologically explicit in places like France right. and Germany, where they're less coy about what they're really doing than we are in the UK, where there's a pretense to try and protect women. But there they say, no, secularism is right, and you can't have this, because they kind of make it much more ideologically triumphalist and explicit. I think, but even in English history, not that far back, I've seen actual film footage of women coming out of factories in the north of England, and this is like late 19th century, early 20th century, and they're all wearing hijab, or more than that. They're all covered up, looking very Islamic actually. And this is clearly white English working class women. En masse. It simply wasn't an issue. It was the norm. So it's not like it's just a Muslim other. This is something that we, in our own history, in the UK, were comfortable with and practiced on a massive scale. And also in terms of Christianity, obviously in the Bible, in the New Testament, Paul tells women to wear hijab. He didn't use the word hijab, but
right.
When they pray. Make sure women are covered. And people say to me, oh, well, that maybe in the church, but not all the time. But then Paul also says, pray without ceasing. That's 1 Thessalonians. So the whole idea that women should basically be covered at all times. And again, that's being gently ignored by recent Christians, because that they prefer the secular feminist icon of the liberated woman who wears very little. So these ideas, whether it be the traditional working class practice in England, in the factories up north, or the Christian principle of women wearing headscarves, are indigenous to the West, obviously, but are just completely forgotten. And yet we see the hijab as the other, but in fact it was actually part of our own history. And so
there's actually a book about it called, I think it's called Uncovering the Moon or something. Sorry, I'll look it up. It's a book about veils in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, right? And it talks about how historically all three, communities had expressions of veiling, right? And it was just normal.
Absolutely.
And it was respected. It was seen as a respectable thing, right? Yeah. I was thinking, like the other day I was listening to this thing about Princess Diana. Okay, don't know why. And I grew up in the age of Diana, and I was hearing about how she used to wear a disguise, right? Oh, right. in order to go out sometimes, right? She'd wear a wig, glasses, a very heavy coat. Okay. And I was just thinking, wow, like, women, especially famous women, they're very exposed. They actually have no privacy, right? Mm-hmm. And whereas when you think about like the wives of, I don't know, the kings and the princes in the Muslim world, sometimes you wouldn't even know who they are, right?
Yeah,
they have a level of privacy that women in Western countries could only dream of, right? Especially like royalty, etc. So I think also like the oppression that's going on in Western societies against women you know, the sexual harassment, the fact that women are saying, you know, wait a minute, why do we have to wear heels to work? These heels actually hurt, you know, but we have to be performative. We have to, you know, play this game. There's a pressure on us to be a certain way, or we won't get the job, or we won't get treated, you know, properly. The number of girls signing up to becoming, you know, to being on OnlyFans, girls being exploited in all sorts of ways, right? In Western societies, I think all of that is ignored. And the spotlight is deflected and to put onto Muslim women as, look, these are the really oppressed people, right? And people have been conditioned to see it like that. Oh yeah, that's the image.
Just a screenshot while you were talking. This is actually a still from a video that I mentioned. I think it's been colorized. I've seen the original. It's black.
Yeah, it's been colorized.
Girls wearing a hijab 100 years ago. So if you just Google that, folks, on YouTube, English girls wearing hijab 100 years ago, and watch the video, absolutely extraordinary. And they're all wearing hijab. And this is the, you know, the standard wear at that time. It's standard modesty. And all the men, of course, and the boys wore hats as well, of course. That's the other thing that's different today.
That was the respectable way to be, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, I wanted to mention something that our friend and brother Joram van Clavern, who used to be the Dutch far right politician. You know, he was part of Geert Wilders. Sorry, I'm trying to pronounce the words properly. You know, although it's spelled Geert Wilders.
I give up with Dutch. I don't know why.
Okay, yeah. You know, he was part of that far right party, the anti-Islam party. And
you can see his Twitter account there. His name is pronounced. I've been corrected by you earlier. Is Joram his first name, as I've always been pronouncing it. But that's who he is. So do follow him on Twitter, by the way. He's very active on media, a brilliant brother, very clever, and just fantastic guy communicating Islam to the Dutch and beyond that to the English-speaking world as well.
So guess what I asked him, Paul? I asked him. I said, Joram, you got to tell me, when you were in that party and when you were in the depths of your like far right ideology, if you'd come across me on the street, right, what would you have thought? What would have gone through your mind? Okay, because that's like the golden question, right? Like, I do believe that part of what we need to do as Muslims is understand the narrative and understand how people are viewing us, right, in order to try to address that. And you'll be so surprised what he said. He said, we saw Muslim women who veiled as wearing a military uniform.
Blimey.
Yeah. He said, you're wearing a uniform and you are here to invade us and to change our societies.
Wow.
I mean, just imagine the level of projection, right? Like, you know, that's having to go into that, right? Like this poor Muslim woman who's walking down the street with her kid, who's I don't know, buying some groceries, is apparently some kind of military figure, right? But he said that this is honestly how we viewed Muslim women who veiled, you know, women who are basically like soldiers, whose job it is to reproduce, have children, to basically invade and take over the West, right? SubhanAllah. So that kind of narrative runs really deep. And I think we have to realize that there are people out there who do view it like that. What do you think when you hear that?
Well, about what he said, I've never heard that before. Actually, I don't doubt that it exists, though. It's some kind of thing that some men, on the political right, might think, completely misrepresenting the actual realities of Muslim men and women in the world. It's so. But I always like to contextualize this. I remember when Catholics in Britain was seen as dangerous, subversive, fifth column, because of their allegiance to the Pope, and the Pope is a military leader because he was that. Not just a token figurehead in the Vatican. So there was seen as a threat, and that goes back centuries, back to James and Elizabeth I. So they were seen as dangerous and weren't given their civil rights and were looked upon with suspicion. And the Eucharist was seen as some kind of vile, evil, satanic rite, and priests were, sinister figures. Jesuits were very sinister. Priests of the Society of Jesus. So all these kind of bizarre tropes.
Yeah.
Today, of course, none of that is the case. And Jews themselves in Europe were often, the blood libel issues, and that they were demonized in quite bizarre and horrific ways in medieval Christian Europe, and persecuted on the basis of their alleged, satanic behaviors and so on. And so the West, I think, it excels, is extremely good at demonizing the other in its,
Russia has been the enemy, like you said, the Irish.
The Irish, not the Irish, yeah, absolutely. So we are the latest, I think.
We are the latest, but it's also been a long-term kind of fetish, or obsession of the West, as we mentioned with the whole Orientalism thing, right? I think what's changed is now we are here, right? Yeah. Whereas in those times it was like those people over there, right?
Yes.
Now it's like these people who are.
We always were here.
Yeah.
We lived in Muslim Spain for 800 years. What is now the Iberian Peninsula. We lived in Bosnia, we lived in southern Italy, we lived in Serbia, etc. And so we were always here. But I think it's I'm not quite sure why that is a problem now. Maybe it's the numbers. Maybe it's
we weren't as visible. We were not as
more visible in London.
Integrated, actually. Yeah.
So it's not like Muslims haven't been. It's not another kind of fake belief or the way we project our own past and create our own past as Europeans. That Islam is a new thing. It's like the United States. Oh well, Muslims are new immigrants. United States, excuse me. Muslims were there in that part of the world before the United States existed, and millions of them as slaves, usually, actually, slaves of their white Christian masters. So Muslims have been part of the West in different kind of ways, marginally or more centrally, forever. I mean, since Islam began, it's so. And we go back to King Offa, the 7th, 8th century English king of England, and you can view coinage of the realm in gold coinage in the British Museum. I've seen it, which has the Shahada on it in Arabic, testifying there's that God of Muhammad is a prophet of God. So why was the English royalty issuing their own currency, gold currency, with Islamic themes on it? Because it was the dominant power, the Muslim world at that time. So Islam had a kind of curious presence even in the British currency going back 1,300 years. So the little things like that make history slightly more interesting than the kind of binary us and them that we get these days.
True. But I do think one thing that has changed was that there wasn't a confident, externalized expression of Islam in people's midst. So I'll tell you why I'm saying that. Like when I was younger, my mum was the only person I knew who wore the hijab. Like we would walk the streets of London, and like now it's normal, right? But when we were younger, she was literally the only one. And a lot of it wasn't because they weren't Muslims. There were a lot of Muslims, but the way the mentality of Muslims was, especially those who came from former colonies, was that we're going to Britain. We have to leave behind our certain of our practices. We have to kind of not stand out, and also many of them, like I know some relatives, etc., who were educated in what they call convent schools in India, right, and Pakistan. So schools left behind by the colonialists, they ended up being like the best schools, right? Like, and English was the medium, etc. They actively looked down on their own religion, right? So they had what we call a colonized mentality, right? And so people came to the UK in their masses, when, especially after the world wars, and they were invited here, especially from former colonies, and many of them were reticent to show their Islam, right? But something has happened, in the next generation, right? Where, so many of our generation, my generation as in who were born in Britain, became more religious than our parents, or discovered religion in a way that our parents hadn't. It's not the case in my personal experience, because my dad was a scholar, Islamic scholar, but I'm talking about like the wider, especially South Asian experience has been that, the next generation ended up discovering Islam, and wanting to adhere to it in a very kind of authentic way, in a non-cultural way. And so sometimes, there've been rifts between families, or even within families, like children bringing their parents back to religion, right? That's quite common. Now, I haven't really thought about what that exactly means for our times, but I do think that phenomenon has surprised
Yes, and it's not just the veil. It's about the religious practice of men and women. It seems
the religiosity
generation is becoming more devout, more committed to faith, which goes completely against the secularization hypothesis that was very fashionable in the latter part of the 20th century. The expectation is that people will become more and more secular. And in fact, the opposite is happening. And even Christianity now, apparently, in the West is showing a turnaround. But I mean, that's still the subject. But I just wanted to share this with you, by the way. I was Googling this. This is the veil in the Middle Ages. No, this is not the Muslim world. This is the West. And there's some extraordinary, I don't know if you can, oh yes, it is happening. Extraordinary pictures there. Female saints wearing double veils. This is from late 10th century. The benedictional of St. Ethelwald. That suggests that was in England. Scrolling down here, detail of philosophy represented several liberal arts to Boethius. Anyway, the women there obviously are wearing headscarves.
And look at every image of Mary.
We have Mary being the presentation in the temple of Jesus, and Mary there on the left is obviously wearing the hijab. Anyway, detailed illustration, the Crusader Bible. Anyway, not sure what that is, but again, more Western white women wearing hijab. And this is my favorite here: detail of the calendar image for June from the Playfair Hours. But these are men and women working in the fields, obviously in 1480s in France, and the woman, of course, was wearing a hijab. The French must be embarrassed about that. So clearly, it was everywhere. Veiling was very common in the Middle Ages. And it was an indigenous Christian practice. It wasn't obviously Islamically influenced. So there's a case for saying the veil is the practice of wearing the veil is something that Western civilization has owned and practiced itself for many, many centuries, and we should stop seeing it alien other. It's only in the recent, like the last century or less, that particularly since 1960s anyway, that feminism try to assert the idea that men and women are interchangeable, they're just the same, and so women should be like men rather than the reverse. And so that's a novelty. It's a recent thing,
right? And I think there's also this narrative that wearing the niqab implies that all men are predatory.
Yes, right? I was going to ask you about that. So another reason to ban the niqab, it is asserted by some people, because it will it is the idea that it implies that all men are predatory. So somehow there's a great slur on men who just want to a universalization of the few rotten apples, and so somehow there's a great slur on men. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, just as we lock our doors at night, right, when we go to sleep, we don't leave our doors open. It doesn't imply that we think every member of society is a burglar, right? But it's a precaution, right? Something that we do, and we consider that to be a normal precaution. For Muslim women, it's not that the onus is on the women; it's the onus is on both men and women. But Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, our Creator, who knows us, who knows how we think, and who understands human psychology better than we do, has decreed certain laws and certain parameters in order to make society function better. So again, I don't really link this to the niqab, because they could say the same argument with hijab, really. You think men are predatory. Why do you have to cover your hair, right? Why cover your bodies even, right? The point is that, as Muslim women, we should have the right to say, I don't want to show my body to everybody, right? I don't want to show my face when I don't want to. And so I think people overstate this. In the Western world at the moment, there is a recognition that there has been a problem with predatory men, actually, right? And what Islam seeks to do is to remove like sexual tension from the public space, right? So that men and women can actually interact. So, for example, it's seen as sexual harassment in the West for a man to, I don't know, inappropriately touch a woman, or to approach her, or to even speak to her in a certain way, right? But it's not seen as sexual harassment for a woman to expose her cleavage to men, right? Who find that kind of thing very distracting, let's say, right? I mean, you can see from psychologists what they say, the effects that a woman has on seeing a woman has on a man is different to the effect that seeing a man has to a woman, right? Men are very visual creatures, and most men, as a default, objectify women. Okay, it's just their wiring. Okay, now that attraction is a beautiful and a great thing when it's in the context of marriage, right? Like, we want our husbands to be attracted to us, and we want them to be very attracted to us. But in the context of a society that's trying to be chaste, a society that's trying to preserve marriages, right? To prevent extramarital relationships. And we know that most affairs and breakdowns of marriage happen because of affairs at work. People having affairs with people who they're interacting with in the workplace. To prevent a society that has that kind of breakdown and decay, Islam takes the kind of sexual element out of the public space. And so actually, Muslim women feel more free when we are covered, and we feel more free to be able to interact with men. We feel free from, what the feminists call the male gaze, right? And all that entails. And so I think it's very disingenuous of the West to have this narrative. Another reflection I was having was, when you hear about Jeffrey Epstein and all of these like terrible like cases of like men who've exploited hundreds and hundreds of women, right? Girls. One of the things that comes to my mind, okay, apart from the fact that of course those men are terrible men, is where are the fathers and where are the men folk who are protecting those women? And one of the terrible things that's happened in Western society is that girls have been stripped of the protection of their menfolk. And this is what certain people are trying to do to Muslim women as well, to strip us of the protection of our menfolk. And throughout history, we know that good men, so it's not that all men are predatory, good men are there to protect women from the bad men, right? If the good men don't step in, if the good men don't have the agency to actually step in, the predatory men run riot. And that's exactly what happened in situations like, Jeffrey Epstein and other famous cases that we hear about. Those girls, they're given a message from a young age that your dad, your menfolk, when you reach the age of 16 or when you reach a certain age, they're nothing to you. You don't have to listen to them. You don't have to be under their care. And the men are also given that message, right? Like, it's not your responsibility to care about your women folk. You're being overprotective if you do. If you comment on like what your daughter's wearing when she's about to go out, out of protectiveness, out of understanding how certain men think, you're considered, like an overprotective prude or something, right? When actually that was a natural mechanism that Allah put in place to protect women from predatory men. So again, we can flip the mirror onto Western society and say, well, why are so many girls so much more vulnerable now? Why has so much of society decayed? Why are there so many broken families? Why are marriages breaking down at a rate that they aren't in other parts of the world? And because the West refuses to reflect on its own shortcomings, it needs to project, Muslims as the other, as much worse, as etc.
Yeah,
I don't know if I've answered that question.
No, you answer and support as well. Yes. No, that's extremely helpful. Yeah, I'm just struck by the fact that this Western civilization versus the Muslim world on this issue is so wrongly construed because of the historic hijab wearing of Western women. In fact, they don't call it hijab, but it's the same bit of cloth, really. And there are lots of examples throughout history, if you Google it, through the Middle Ages and before and afterwards, up to perhaps the beginning of the 20th century, like that video of the working class women up north shows. So this is a very recent kind of, I think, presumably post-feminist kind of concern, really, and absolutely fascinating. Well, this might be a good place to conclude this. Just thank you very much indeed for your time, your expertise, and your calm reasonableness. I just how reasonable what you say sounds, and I just, if people were to open their minds a bit, as I'm sure many people can, to what you're saying, then they will have a change of heart, a change of perspective, and learn to be, that we can live together as Muslims and non-Muslims in the West, as most of us already do. Actually, this is already a reality,
right? And so I think, like in parting, I would like to say to everyone, look. In our laws in the UK, Article 9 of the ECHR, which is the European Convention on Human Rights, which is also the Human Rights Act, within the Human Rights Act, we have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Okay, and that includes the freedom to manifest our religion. Manifest meaning externalize our religion or our beliefs in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. That's the wording, right? That means that that includes the right to wear religious clothing, such as, covering our faces. We're not being unreasonable. We're not saying that in certain situations where there's a security need, or even when there's a, just like a reasonable need to be identified, that a woman shouldn't take her veil off, actually, and just be identified. That's not the problem here. So I don't think people should project that onto the Muslim community as if, Muslims are kind of forcing everyone to kind of, not identify them or something like this, and posing some kind of security risk. The fact is that it's a British value. It's actually very un-British to force people to wear or to not wear certain types of clothing. And I think any women out there and any men who care about, individual autonomy and care about our rights as followers of any religion should be bothered by this. It's not just something that should bother Muslims.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. Absolutely. No, I'm optimistic about the future in the longer term. I think just as we got over the indigenous historic British going back the century, as we got over our paranoias and ignorances about Jewish people and Catholics and Irish people and so on, I think we will ultimately come to terms with Muslims. The fact that many of us are practicing Muslims in our midst. I think this is something human societies are organic and they can change for the better.
Yeah. I think we also need to do our part as Muslims, and I know people don't like this narrative that, they say, well, why should we have to prove ourselves to others? And, I think at the end of the day, we also have to be wise as Muslims and understand that people have been conditioned, so sometimes we might, if you're somebody who wears a veil, or you're somebody who is visibly a Muslim, you might have to go the extra mile, to explain things to people, to be, people might not feel they could talk to you, and you might have to reach out. You might have to be willing to explain, to talk, to to reach out to people. And I think the more people that interact with Muslims, and especially, women who are visibly Muslim, I think the less fear and negativity there will be around this. And that's why you see in places like London, where most people have pretty much interacted with a Muslim woman at some point, right? There's not the same level of animosity and negativity surrounding the veil.
No, indeed. I mean, not that I would know myself, but no, I can imagine that is the case in London for sure. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you very, very much indeed, Fatima, for your time. Absolute joy always to speak to you. I look forward to seeing your new book, your new forthcoming book, Aisha, the Prophet's Heart, coming out soon, inshallah. And we can maybe do a podcast on Aisha one day as well.
Yeah, she was obviously a very famous lady who also covered her face when she was in public.
I didn't know
established through the hadiths. We definitely know that the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they covered their faces when they went out. This is in authentic hadiths.
Fantastic.
So because they're seen as role models, so that's why any women would also like to
emulate.
Yeah,
of course, it's a very honourable.
Exactly.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much. Until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.